Sure,
a little
happy
bit
to.
too broad brush ultimately. And I'll just make one comment about the historical story. You know, the Mendelssohn-Kant contrast is overstated in a way. Kant is in many ways a deeply pessimistic thinker. Waltz picks up on this. When he writes about Kant, he wants to see Kant as a realist of sorts. And that's problematic, but there are many elements, in fact, of Kant which, you know, would seem to me to fit into what you're describing as philosophical pessimism. There's a lot of overlap between Kant and the realists. So Kant said we have, if we want to build a republic, let's assume people are devils. You know, that's philosophical pessimism. I just don't see, you know, I don't see them siding with Mendelssohn, and I guess what I'm plus, I mean, I guess I don't get. I'd love to hear more about what you mean specifically by philosophical pessimism. There's a lot of different things going on. There are a lot of different assumptions about human nature, psychology, all kinds of other things, history. One has to take that apart. The other presentation I really love that as well. I think the moment you're pointing to is fascinating, right? Is it all that distinct historically, or what is specifically distinct about it? I mean, a lot of the things you were talking about, both of you very eloquently, I think you could find similar things going on at earlier moments in U.S. foreign policy debates. World War I. I mean, when we go through the list of things you mentioned, and that's happening there. You don't have the realist intellectuals from Europe engaged, right? But a lot of other things are actually going on. I mean, concerns about an American answer versus a European one, a different conception of leadership versus a European one, the importance of, you know, this very interesting relationship you described between public opinion and grand strategy. That's also going on, even in people like Wilson. So maybe if you could just say a little bit more about what's historically distinct in your view about that. Maybe you did this and I just missed it. Thanks.
Would you like to answer?
Well, do you want to take
another question? Yeah. So, your question?
Well, thanks. I can't remember Sunday morning when I enjoyed myself. That's my I'm actually, I think the whole recording bit is so crucial. Like, I remember reading Mike's book when he said, like, the problem is that realism is so unrealistic about all things, and it's precisely this kind of little game of action where you can enter the scene. And I think that's very important. I'm just wondering, like, especially like in Viveke's call to action, like let's not forget about the grand scheme, the bigger picture, like holistic view. I'm just wondering, like, if our kind of approach of taking realism and adding adjectives in front of it, even in this like recent revival. I mean, we have like political realism now, we have progressive realism. I'm really like, especially given the whole fragmentation of IR as a discipline in general. I wonder if that's helpful, and if like this kind of rhetoric in terms of like how we label ourselves is really helpful. If it's maybe better if we reclaim the realism that we consider to be realistic, and reclaim from the kind of unwanted children of the first generation of realists.
Take a third question, then Vasilios.
Yeah, I really enjoyed both presentations. I have a question for Rengger. I fully agree with the general structure of the argument there, and I tried to argue something similar in my presentation yesterday, and how you know, the realist pessimism has to be seen as a specific kind of pessimism that bears similarities with how Dienstag, actually, as you mentioned, presents Nietzschean pessimism. And actually, yeah, it's very obvious. For example, Morgenthau ends the scientific man versus power politics with a Pascalian wager in the last page, where it says, you know, without assurance of victory, without the oath, and with the oath against him, and so on. But I was wondering whether there is, we can locate a specific, some sort of a difference between perhaps Morgenthau's pessimism and Niebuhr's pessimism. I would venture to call Morgenthau's pessimism a pessimism of potentially, I don't know, I'm still, you know, wondering about that pessimism of despair, and Niebuhr's pessimism of hope. And I wonder whether this different, if we can locate this different disposition that has to do with the fact that for Niebuhr there is a sort of vantage point, you know, it's his Christian faith outside, you know, the immanence of everyday politics. Whereas for Morgenthau, I mean, Morgenthau perhaps is not ready to take that step. And I was wondering whether we can make a distinction there, or whether it is the same pessimism.
Okay, who wants to go first? If you go. Don't know.
Go ahead, Nick.
You want me to go first? Sure.
Okay, in a way, both Bill's question, Vasilis' question, linking the same thing, which is pessimism and all of that. And then there's a separate thing to do with Kant and Mendelssohn, so I'll come back to the Kant and Mendelssohn thing in a minute. The first thing to say is that I think Josh Dienstag's account of pessimism is very, very, very good and very interesting. And in two particular ways, I think, helps in the context of thinking about realism. The first is that he emphasizes that the pessimism he's talking about is a modern sensibility. It's not, in a sense, first of all, it's not dispositional. It's not just whether you're a sunny guy, like Kempels, or a brooding guy like Hans Morgenthau. It's about, and in Dienstag's case, it comes out of a sense of the possibilities of life outrunning you. It's that he associates it initially with the birth of clock time in Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, and it develops from there. And he explores a number of cultural expressions of it, the appearance of memento moris in art and various other things. And of course he says explicitly, and I think he's quite right, that it takes a number of different forms. And he in the book, he takes 4 particular forms that it takes. And so it's not all of the piece. So in that sense, it seems to me that one can say, exactly as you were saying in your paper, one can look at individual realists and see them as representative of different kinds of pessimism. You might say, for example, that Morgenthau is in a certain sense a Dionysian pessimist in some respects. And other realists perhaps might be indicative of a different kind of pessimism. So, and pessimism, as Dienstag also emphasizes, is something that in a certain sense is liberating. That once you recognize that certain things cannot happen and that life has inevitable dissonances, yes, it's a problem at one level, but at the same time it's a liberation. So one does not need to abandon all good things simply because one cannot have all good things. So I think the first response that I make to both of you is to say, yes, absolutely, one can see realists as different kinds of pessimists, and there may indeed be people who are dispositionally optimistic and dispositionally pessimistic as well. Of course, we all are somewhere along that scale. And also, it helps us to understand, I think, precisely why some of the usual political categories don't work very well when one is looking at the realists. A right-left thing doesn't really help sometimes. The other thing, just specifically on Morgenthau and Niebuhr, and you mentioned Christian realism, Niebuhr's Christian realism. There is a section in the paper which you will read with interest when you get a chance to, where I look at, towards the end of the paper, where I look at what I said right at the end, i.e. the question is, do we think the wager works, and do we think that it can in fact sustain the weight that realists want to put on it? And what is interesting, it seems to me, is how many of the contemporary realists, not merely, as it were, the conventional ones, that is to say the Walters, the Mearsheims, the Wolfels, and so on, but people who aren't as often talked about by our circles, Jean Elshtain, for example, either take some version of the providentialist assumption, or end up becoming Christian realists, which Elshtain has identified herself with quite explicitly so. And the interesting thing there is a debate that is now beginning to go on in political theology between whether or not one can have a genuine Christian realism, or what it looks like. So people like Elshtain, for example, I gave a talk to a conference also in Edinburgh, where the two keynote speakers, it was a conference deliberately designed to bring together theologians, political theorists, IR people, and they had two keynotes, Oliver O'Donovan, who's a theologian, just retired from Edinburgh, as a theologian, and me. Ironically, I talked about theology and he talked about politics. But there you go figure. But one of the things that was interesting, that I thought was interesting, that I talked about there, was the extent to which some of the contemporary theologians, like John Wilbank, for example, example, and even Charles Taylor, who's obviously not a theologian, are very strongly critical of Niebuhr's version of Christian realism, and indeed Elstein's. And so part of what is at stake in that, it seems to me, is the character of Christian realism. Niebuhr, I think, was a Christian realist and was, in a certain sense, a pessimist. And that is precisely what separated him from his brother, even though they were enormously close across their whole lives. And it's what separates, it seems to me, people like Elstein, who is dispositionally, I think, very strongly optimistic, but also pessimistic, from somebody like Milbank. So, I mean, I think that in that context, there is a lot of work to be done, and a lot of interesting things to come out. Very briefly on Kant and Mendelssohn. Well, you're absolutely spot on, right, of course, to note that I am using Kant in a sense as a placeholder. I don't think unfairly, and I'm using Mendelssohn as a placeholder too, and I'm not suggesting that this is a fully rounded interpretation of Mendelssohn's thought, because it isn't. I'm taking one particular thing, one particular argument between them, as being indicative of what you might call two different trajectories of grounding certain things. And absolutely there need to be a lot more said about that. What I do think is interesting is, in a sense, again, one of the things that I think goes with the realist sensibility, certainly in its pessimistic form, as I suggest it should be seen, is an emphasis on limits. This is something that comes out very, very strongly in both Niebuhr and in Morgenthau, and particularly in scientific maths, on our lack of knowledge, on our inability to know things. We have to be careful about this. And there is a line of Kant interpretation, perhaps most celebratedly by Iris Murdoch, that says the Kantian autonomous individual had his best expression actually 100 years before Kant wrote. His name is Lucifer. The better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The man of pure autonomy is in fact a fallen angel. And I think that there is a certain sense in which that strand of Enlightenment thought, even if that's an unfair way of reading Kant, but that strand of Enlightenment thought that sees us as to some extent separated out from the limits that constitute us, is precisely what the realists were reacting against. That first generation of realists were reacting against. So without wanting to suggest that this paper or project will offer a definitive interpretation of Moses Mendelssohn, which it certainly won't, I do think that there's something in those two trajectories, and that I was using that as a device to separate them.
Okay. To your question, Bill, what's distinctive about that moment? Obviously, there's the most sort of indistinctive part of it is this is what the American political tradition is about. This is what it's founded out of. The Federalist Papers is one long debate about how do you somehow how do you found a public that doesn't land you in majoritarianism, factions, etc. So there's nothing new about American political debate and theory being about that question. But there's something, I think there's two things in the 20th century context and obviously in the experience of the rise of fascism, Nazism and so on, that heightens this. And that's, first of all, the emergence of mass politics, which is something we try and lay out more detailedly in the paper than we were able to do here. That just sort of underpins also Tocqueville's points about where this kind of politics might land you. So that's one thing that just crystallizes or activates the concern. And I think there's another thing that links to much of what Leslie's talked about yesterday, what you talked about today. And I think that is the intensification of secularism is something that actually also intensifies the concern about can this type of politics work in a completely secularized context? Because I'm not so sure that this vision stands on nothing. I actually think you mentioned Lincoln, and why are they so obsessed with Lincoln? There's a brilliant book by John Patrick Dickens about Lincoln. It's not a book about Lincoln, really. It's a book about the realist fascination and the American fascination with Lincoln, and it's called Abraham Lincoln on Holy Grounds. And it's on holy grounds because it's a vision that none of this sort of relativistic vision of what democracy is about and how democracy has to be based on a very relativistic notion of the ideals that it constantly negotiates, but it has to be embedded in a fundamental idea that there are certain ideas that are transcendent. Transcendent in the sense that we cannot reach them, we cannot know what they mean, but they have to be there, we have to believe in their transcendence so that they may humble us. And without that, I mean, it's all over Niebuhr, but it's certainly also all over Morgenthau's writings, I would say. And I think that this is a moment where politics has lost, and sort of the public sphere has lost an ability to speak that language and to understand what that might mean. So that is also what is a notion of the sacred, a notion of what it means that something is holy, and that it shouldn't become, you know, a political theology in the modern sense of certainty. That's also something that's very important about this moment, I would say.
Okay, very quickly, your comments I think were really, really appropriate, and I think this is a session that hopefully we can kick them around a lot more, and so maybe we can leave them till then and then come on to those. Bill, I think you're dead right, and there are at least two interesting directions in which one can take this. There's absolutely no doubt that the debates of the late 1940s and the 1950s mirror those that you see in the United States back, let's say, to the Federalists, but you certainly see post the Civil War, right? And at one level, one thing you can do here is link this up to a revisioning of disciplinary history that's taking place, right? And Luke has been part of this, et cetera, about, you know, whether the first debate ever took place, right? And the conventional wisdom, the emerging historiographical disciplinary wisdom seems to be, in historical reality in the 1930s, no, it never did. In retrospective historical realities, yes, it did take place because it was a rhetorical construction of the realists of the 1950s, right, in order to give themselves a rhetorical foil to play against. In other words, the first debate was a creation of the second debate, right, et cetera, et cetera. If that's the case, and you get rid of the idea of the naive American liberalism that was supposedly destroyed in the first debate, then you can actually open up a lineage in American thought that links the debates of the late 1940s and the 1950s, and indeed I would then go forward from that, back through American thinking, but for me particularly, through the debates over pragmatism, right? And the crucial figures here, you can find them in the people, the realists, like Oliver Wendell Holmes is one of the most interesting in this way, right? But more significant, you begin to get the division in the pragmatist lineage. You know, if to some extent you can read the German lineage as the divisions that come out of Weber, to some extent you can read the American lineage, I think, as the divisions that come out of Dewey, right? And the crucial people here are Niebuhr on the one hand, and somebody that I know, Vibeke, I'm not sure if you published that piece yet, I haven't read it, I was interested in myself as well, but somebody we never talk about, Sidney Hook. If you really want to understand American realism, it's that bifurcation that gives you what are the crucial trajectories. And then it links up. And if that's the case, then what we might call American realism just looks radically different than anything that the field thinks it looks like. But that is an argument that is so outlandish to most IR people that God knows how many weeks you would need to try to even make it sensibly in the United States today. I happen to think it's right. So you're dead right, and it opens up loads of interesting stuff.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 2 more questions in 10 minutes. Now we have 3 more questions. Still 10 minutes. Yeah. Yeah, please. Yeah. Thank you. And then you. That's the 4th question within 10 minutes. I'm not quite sure whether we can make that. So just to stay with the order, you and then.
Thanks a lot. Actually, unlike Robert, I understood both papers actually as unifying and as making kind of a bigger narrative about realism as such. So my question is in this direction. It looks to me that actually both the first paper by saying what is unacknowledged contemporary strategy and how it can relate the rhetorics to kind of classical realism, about contemporary realism as such, Mearsheimer's position is not only kind of silly and reflective and so on, but there's also underneath of it, there's some good philosophical reason for it, something which Morgenthau has to work for, but maybe actually it's not only that effort, that philosophical engagement there, but actually these are two equally good responses to a particular problem. Perhaps comment on that.
I've got a question for Mike and Vibeke. I mean, you said about the crystallization of the movement and the worries about fascism and Nazism, but we were silent on Bolshevism and communism completely, and those are the other great practitioners of realism, right? They solve the question of mobilization since the very beginning, right? It's Trotsky asking in 1917, how do we make the Mujik fight? And they have got the advantage, and there must be an obvious barrier that they have figured out a better way how to mobilize. So I wonder if you could maybe expand.
Yeah. So first, an apology, but my knowledge of political realism is very rustic. It's not my field, so maybe my question will also be very rustic. So I really apologize. Listening to those two fascinating presentations from me, now I really want to dig more. Opening up a new, field of spending time on what I'm not supposed to. My question would be about perfectibility. Is realism a perfectibilist theory? That's more for Nick, and maybe for Vibeke and Mike. Where would you locate this perfectibility?
This what?
Perfectibility. Right, it's 300 years of Rousseau's verse, in as a GP, and I had to bring it up. So I hope it's not too rustic. I really just something I want to throw in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just go ahead.
Okay. Camilla, on Morgenthau, if you nudge Morgenthau, does it become Mearsheimer? No, and I think what is interesting, and I'm interested to hear what other people think maybe in the session after lunch. In general, I think one of the things that I was hinting at when I said traditions are difficult things to put together is because very often traditions are composed retrospectively, as we, in the context of the great debates and so on. Mike's already made that point. I don't think John Mearsheimer thinks of himself as responding to a crisis of the environment. I would find it, I suspect he would look rather puzzled if you gave him that description of what he's doing. But in a certain sense, we stand where we do because of where others have stood before us. And it does seem to me that the reason, I think, for the great interest in the first generation of realists, and not merely Morgenthau either, but I think they are enormously interesting figures for all kinds of reasons, is because they are doing this. And then something is established. And of course, it goes in a number of different directions. And it is competing with other things that are pushing. So American political thought has a distinct character, as Mike and Vibeke quite rightly say. That's Dick Hofstadter's famous line. It was the problem of America not to have an ideology, but to be one. But at the same time, you're getting the way in which universities work are changing dramatically after the Second World War. The amount of funding coming in, this is one of the things that launches formal modelling and all the rest of it, because it comes out of the war, it comes out of the OSS and so on. These are competing, as it were, pressures on both individuals and on thinking patterns. So when you get to contemporary realists, it does seem to me that very often they are making similar movements, making similar assumptions, but not always explicitly, or not always explicitly in the manner in which somebody like Niebuhr and Morgenthau were, because they were, as it were, to use Dean Asheson's wonderful phrase, present at creation. The one just side comment, Sidney Hook. There is a wonderful, if you want an example of a certain kind of realism, read Sidney Hook's review of Saint-Léon's Dominations and Powers, which comes out in 1950, as the book does. Hook is utterly astonished by this book and hates it, absolutely abominates it. I happen to think it's one of the best and most underread works of political philosophy of the 20th century. But the reason why Hook hates it is he cannot find a way in that identifies with any of the political ideologies that are going on at the time. So it's a book that is resolutely there's just no way in. If what you want is to write about the American left versus the American right, or the threat of communism, or the defense of a free society. And because Santayana had been a friend, well, indeed a student of James, the assumption that I think Hooke made going into it is that this man's a pragmatist. And, of course, Santayana was not a pragmatist at all. So I think the reaction is the reaction of the engaged actor to someone who is fundamentally detached. And Hooke and all of the realists would have said, this is a world in which we cannot be detached. We have to be engaged. And so that attitude across many different areas, it seems to me to be one of the things that links the realists together. For whatever their methodological differences, whatever their national original differences, that is one of the things that absolutely, you can't just stand on the sidelines and not be engaged. Sorry, perfectibility. I don't think realism has a perfectibilist bone in its body, to be honest. I think the whole point of the realist, the original realist emphasis on limits was precisely, we are not the kind of creatures that can be perfectible. And in a certain sense, you certainly find that very explicitly stated by Niebuhr. And of course, in Niebuhr's case, there is the thing about original sin as well, and grace. But I think that even in non-Christian realists like Morgan, but as I said, and as I think many people in this room have written, that doesn't mean that realists are conservatives or pessimists in the traditional sense of the term. It doesn't mean they don't believe in progress. It doesn't mean they don't think you can do better than we do. They all do that, and indeed part of the moral outrage that you find in Niebuhr's writings in the 1930s is that he's convinced that we can do a lot damn sight better than we do.
Ideally speaking, 2 minutes.
Okay, ideally speaking.
You do.
Okay,
Which is
no.
impossible.
No, no, you do.
I'll just give a quick answer to the question of mobilization then. I think actually perhaps we talk about mobilization. In many ways it's a term that our paper would want to distance itself from to some extent, because it's so tied to the sort of instrumentalist vision of manipulation. That's not what we're talking about. I think that, and that would also be the analysis of what was wrong, and the realist analysis of what was wrong with Eastern as well as Western modes of totalitarian mobilization. I think what's really fundamental here is that they did not connect it again to this notion that they're not they don't have a view of anthropological either in man. They have this notion that we're not perfectible, that there isn't given meaning in the world, because we have a free will. We have the capacity both for self-transcending our personal interests and for pursuing them, that we have that dual nature all of the time, for doing good or doing evil. That's the experience of ambiguity and extreme freedom that human beings are faced with in the 20th century. So we don't just look for meaning because there is none. We look for a realm or a narrative that will help us interpret that ambiguity. And Morgenthau says somewhere that fascism was better than liberalism at understanding that we seek these interpretations. But it failed in understanding, in the long run, that we don't just want closure. It will not be meaningful to us to have that, that totalitarian closure. What's meaningful is to be presented with political languages, political philosophies that can encompass, that can embody ambiguity, the experience of ambiguity. And they believed that there was something in this American tradition and in this vision of politics that had that capacity. So I think perhaps to even talk about mobilization runs against, or at least to reduce this to mobilization, runs against what we are trying to do.
Although in the context of mass politics, it's absolutely crucial, and one of the fascinating things, just to come back to disciplinary self-reflection here. In theory of international relations, the idea of the politics of mass politics is almost never spoken about. Right? So when you think back to the old triptych of realism, liberalism, Marxism, the crucial question for all of those, being the rise of mass politics in the 20th century, never finds its way in international relations theory at all, ever, right? Which is a great shame.
with one, well, not in the IR theory.
Yeah, no, no, IR theory.
But there are
That's what I mean.
IR thinkers,
Yes.
writers who reflect on it.
Yes, yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
he hates it.
Yeah.
He tolerates it. He doesn't
Yes.
like it,
Yeah.
but he does reflect.
Yeah, but in IR theory
But
as a
not-
thing, it just disappears. Stop.